My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the Executive Director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings.
So tonight I'm going to be talking about children's past life memories. As I talk today, listen for these three things as I tell the stories of these children's memories, because I think this is particularly fascinating because of the purity of these memories coming from very young children. They're very credible stories that offer very convincing evidence for the continuation of a personal consciousness after death. Many of you have probably read some of the accounts of near-death experiences, which are pretty amazing, but this is taking it a step further, because these are children who remember having lived before. They usually remember their deaths, and they remember their previous lives. Also, as you listen to these stories, hopefully it will expand your idea of the origins of personality. As one of my mentors, Ian Stevenson, said, there are three streams that feed into personality: nature, nurture, and reincarnation. So as you listen to these stories, keep that in mind, and hopefully you'll walk away feeling different about children and about reincarnation. And my work in this field is a very small field worldwide, I have to say. There are probably a dozen people doing this kind of research in the world, taking it seriously. And my research diverges from theirs in that I'm not really trying to verify every case of a child's past life memory. Because of what I'm going to tell you, I saw the potential for healing the soul through these memories. Children bring up these memories because quite often they need to heal trauma from the past. So, how did I get into this? Well, I was minding my own business and as a mother in Asheville, North Carolina, where we were living in the 80s. And on the 4th of July, 1988, we had a picnic at our house, and we had a lot of kids there with their parents. And we took my son, my 5-year-old son, Chase, to the fireworks display. And as soon as the big booming sounds began, he became absolutely terrified. And it was odd because we had taken him to other 4th of July celebrations before, but on this particular evening, he became absolutely hysterical, so much so that I had to take him home. And he really wouldn't calm down. He was crying. And I remember rocking him in the rocking chair. He was that big at the time. And I couldn't figure out what had happened. Immediately I was trying to figure out if he had been exposed to any loud sounds like that before. And as far as I knew, since I was a stay-at-home mother, he hadn't. But I figured, well, he probably had too much sugar and was just hyped up from all the kids at the house. So I kind of wrote it off as any mother would. But then a few weeks later, we went to an indoor swimming pool in Asheville, the first time we'd been there. And as soon as we walked into the building, people were diving on the diving board, making this big reverberating noise from the walls. And again, this big booming sound made Chase hysterical. And he pulled me out of the building, and I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "I'm scared of those noises." And that was it. He finally calmed down, but I thought, well, this is really curious, and I didn't really know what to do about it. So as fate would have it, and I believe everybody's journey is orchestrated, and mine certainly was, a hypnotherapist from Florida was visiting me in Asheville because a year earlier I had done a past life regression with him. His name is Norman Ng, because I had chronic lung problems. And that in that 1 2-hour session, My lung problems were cured after I remembered dying of consumption in the 19th century and remembering a very emotional death of dying in the gas chambers of World War II, where the last thing I was aware of was inhaling the gas. And I had a major catharsis during that 2-hour session, and to my utter surprise, my lungs cleared up. So Norman was visiting because my medical doctor was so amazed by my recovery that he wanted to do a regression, as I had done a year earlier, and so did about 10 of my friends. So Norman was staying with me, and Chase was about to start school. And I asked Norman, since he was a hypnotherapist, if he could give Chase some kind of post-hypnotic suggestion, so when he went to school and if he were exposed to these loud sounds, he wouldn't become hysterical. Up until that moment, I had absolutely no idea that a child could have a past life memory. So Norman, who is a very wise man, said to Chase, who again was this big, you know, looking at me, he was half my size. He said, "Sit on your mom's lap, close your eyes, and tell me what you see when you hear the loud sounds that frighten you." And immediately I could see his eyelids fluttering as if he were getting some visuals. And he said, "I'm crouching behind a rock. I'm a soldier. I have a gun, a long gun with a sword at the end. There's smoke everywhere. I don't even know who I'm shooting at. I don't want to be here." So I was scanning, you know, what Sesame Street episode could this be? What Mr. Rogers? The kids, we actually had a bumper sticker on our television. Robert might remember, "Kill your television." I mean, the only TV the kids watched was PBS. And at that point, this is 1988, we didn't really have, you know, maybe they saw a few Disney movies. So as he was saying this, I'm going, you know, where is this coming from? I had no idea. So Norman just asked him open-ended questions. Well, then what happens is, "Oh, I'm shot in the wrist." And he held his right wrist and he said, "I black out." Norman said, "Then what happens?" And he said, "They take me to a hospital, but it's not like a regular hospital. It's just these poles in the ground with some covering on top. And they put me on a bed, but it's not like a regular bed. It's just a hard bench." He described this bed, which was really a hard bench. And he said, "They bandage my wrist and they tell me I have to go back to battle. I don't want to be there. I don't want to shoot other people. And I miss my wife and family." And I still get emotional talking about this all these years later, because that was the moment when I had the goosebumps and I realized we're in completely new territory. So wise Norman said to Chase, he detected that Chase felt very bad about having to be a soldier and kill other people. He's clearly stated he didn't want to be there fighting. And Norman said in very simple language to a 5-year-old, "We live many different lifetimes on Earth. It's like actors in a play. We play these different roles, and sometimes we have to be soldiers, and sometimes we have to kill others in battle, and sometimes we're killed. But it's okay. There's no blame." And I didn't know whether my son would understand that as a 5-year-old, but I could feel his body relaxing on my lap. So Norman proceeded and he said, "Well, then what happens, Chase?" And he said, "Well, they make me go back to battle. I don't want to go." And he said, "I was walking down a dusty road and there were chickens on the road. And I saw this wagon, a big wagon with big wheels being pulled by horses, and there's a cannon on it." I didn't even know he knew what a cannon was. And he said, "They make me go behind the cannon." And then all of a sudden he opened his eyes and jumped off my lap, grabbed a cookie and went to play with his Legos. And, you know, I was pretty stunned, to say the least. And my daughter was sitting with us, my 9-year-old Sarah. She was 9 at the time. She's 38 now. And she said, "Mom, that place where Chase said he was shot in his wrist, that's where his eczema is. And I think in the excitement of the moment, I missed it. But since Chase had been a baby, he had a chronic and severe eczema on that spot on his wrist, which he had clutched when he said he was shot in the wrist, which they had bandaged. And I had tried homeopathy, all kinds of allergy treatments, salves, ointments, and that eczema just got worse and worse. It would not go away. In fact, I had to bandage his wrist at night because he would scratch relentlessly and bloody the sheets. So the upshot of this 10 or 15 minute recollection was that Chase's eczema cleared up within a couple of days. And very soon thereafter, he asked for his first drum kit. Aren't we lucky? And he was making big booming sounds all the time, and he still does at almost 35. So we were moving from Asheville right after that, so I kind of put all of this on hold, but I was totally obsessed with trying to figure out what had happened with Chase, why his eczema went away, why his phobia went away of the loud booming sounds. And we were moving, we moved to Media. And shortly after we moved, I was eating breakfast alone with Chase one morning. And he said, "Mom, remember when I was a soldier?" He hadn't brought it up in 6 months or so. And we hadn't talked about it because we were so busy with the move. And I said, yeah. And he said, "Well, we talked differently." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, actually, I was black. I was a black soldier." And I said, "Oh, okay." And he went back to spooning his cereal, like something, it's like a day in the life, right? So I thought, well, that's kind of ironic, because if you saw Chase, he's this white boy, redhead in this life. And I thought, well, we change race, we change sex, why not? And didn't hear anything about it. That was that. And then about a year later, Chase went to second grade, and it was right after that first Iraq invasion, Desert Storm, and they were putting up yellow ribbons all over his elementary school. And he got in the car when I picked him up, and he said, he was very upset, and I said, "Chase, what's going on?" And he said, "Mom, they don't understand what war really is. They're putting up all these yellow ribbons." He said, "My memories are coming back." So by this time, I had started training in past life therapy with Roger Wolger and some other people. And when we got home, I said, "Chase, lie down, close your eyes, and go back to that scene that you saw with Norman." And he went back, and almost verbatim, word for word, he recounted the story of being on the battlefield, being shot on the wrist. But this time, since he was older and had acquired more language, he told me more about before the war. Before he went to war, he said, and this is his word, 7-year-old, "I'm a free black man." And he said, "I live in a town and it sounds like Colosso." And we never could trace where that was. And he said, "I have a wife, I have 2 children, I'm a peaceful man, I make pots." And he said, they put up posters in my town to get people to go to war, and I couldn't read, and I signed up, and I didn't know what I was getting into. This is from a 7-year-old in first-person perspective, and that's significant too, that it was first-person perspective. And he said, and then he started talking about the battle again, and he said, this time he went beyond what he did the first time, and he said, "They put me behind the cannon, I have to pull this string." I thought, that's a weird detail. I didn't know cannons had strings. And he said, all of a sudden, I'm floating above the battlefield, looking down, and he said, "I died." And he said, "I see smoke below." And he said, "It's a relief to be out of there." And he said, when you're, and these are his words, and I had never read any Raymond Moody to him about near-death experiences, or I had never talked to him about this. He said, when you're in spirit, you can go back and see what happened to your family, and I want to go back and say goodbye to them. And he said, everyone has to experience a war. It teaches you how other people feel. It's a bad thing, but everybody has to experience it. And he said he was up, He missed World War II, and he wanted to come back to a happier time. So that was really, that pushed me even more deeply into doing research of children's memories, finding out if other children had these memories too, and what other parents' experiences were. But I have to add an epilogue to this story. You know, after publishing the first book, second book, going on television, going on Oprah, telling, and Chase and my daughter went on Oprah with me in 1994 to tell their stories, along with some other parents. And I said, well, his eczema disappeared and never came back. But that's not quite accurate, because after all of this, after it was published and I went and did all this television, he came home one weekend from Temple. He was a Temple student. And he said, Mom, my eczema's back. And my first reaction was, oh, crap. After I told everyone it had gone away. I was more upset about that than his eczema being back. And I said, well, Chase, what's been going on in your life? And he stood there thinking, and he said, I had to sign up for the draft for loans. So even the thought of possibly serving in the military again brought up the body memory. And after he said that and made that connection, it's gone. Okay, now fast forward from age 18 to 34, he hasn't had it since. And hopefully he never will again. So around the age of 7, after that, he recalled all of that and had some, it seemed he had some closure after saying goodbye to his wife and family. He said, Mom, I'm starting to forget what I experienced, and I want to write it down. So this is 7-year-old Chase's aerial view of the battlefield. And his spelling is atrocious, but, you know, he was 7. But it's very detailed. He had the visual memory without the emotional memory at this point. And it was really funny because Oprah used this on her show, and she hired a Civil War historian to try to verify, you know, which battle he had been in. And the historian said that the kind of artillery Chase described was very accurate to the time. Here's he was shot in the wrist. That was his description of the hospital. Just this tent with poles, and he said there were like leaves or material covering it. And as a result of the Oprah show, a Civil War historian sent me some photos which kind of corroborated what Chase said. These are just hints. However, these were field hospitals. You see the poles with the material. And Chase described the wagon with being led by the horse. And these are the Civil War historian. I don't know if you can even read that, but he described the cannon. And actually, these were called mortars. And this is what they looked like. If you can see the horse in the front pulling the big wheeled wagon with the mortars. And I think this is a really interesting photo of a black Civil War soldier standing next to his cannon. I thought, wouldn't that be really interesting if that was Chase? Stranger things have happened in my household. So I started doing my research. This was pre-internet days, and I was relying on talking to parents in my community, especially Asheville. There were some like-minded parents who wouldn't be freaked out if I asked them if their kids had any past life memories. And I started seeing patterns in these memories. And one of the obvious things that I was seeing was that children were very young when they started talking about these memories. And Chase was actually on the older side at 5. Usually these memories tend to fade around 5 to 7. And when young children talk about these memories, some of them are still in diapers, mind you. They're that young. Their tone of voice is very matter of fact. If you have small children or are familiar with small children, when they talk about a fantasy, it's usually with a kind of lilting tone of voice, like the prince and the king and with the children's memories as they begin to talk about them, sometimes as soon as they can talk. They will tell you very matter-of-factly and directly in a very serious tone. They'll say something like, when I was big before, I was a soldier. Or when I was big before, I had a farm and the farm burned down and my family and I were killed. This is coming from a 2 or 3-year-old. So they're very direct, it's very matter-of-fact, they have a different tone of voice. Sometimes they use words outside of their normal vocabulary. Quite often they'll talk about things that are totally outside their range of experience, too. And sometimes it's just one statement. And I have this great little case that I want to share with you. And some of these cases are just a single remark. A kid will say, well, when I was big, I died when I fell off the boat. They might have a phobia relating to water or not, but they'll just make one statement and not repeat it. I got this very cute little email from a woman in England who told me about her daughter, Elizabeth, who at 2.5, and this is the first time I've told this story publicly, so I'm cheating a little bit. They were in the garden, and they were weeding the garden, and the little girl Elizabeth asked her mother, what is this flower? And the mother said, they're daisies. And she said, oh, just like me, I'm Daisy Pickles. So her mother thought, well, that's kind of weird, But from that point on, from 2.5 on until the age of 5, she insisted that everybody call her Daisy Pickles. And she also developed this very unusual behavior. They lived near an airstrip in England, and anytime they had jets and prop planes there, but anytime a prop plane would go over, Elizabeth would run to the hall, lie down, cover her head, and go stiff. And her mother said she was absolutely terrified, and there was no way to talk her out of this. So years later, Elizabeth's mother received the genealogy of the family from her father, who said, you've got to look at this. And she did, and there was a Daisy Pickles in the family line who died in 1942 in London. Yeah, and I did some research because I thought, well, the Blitz was in 40 and 41, so that didn't add up. But good old Wikipedia, there were shorter, more intense bombings in different cities around England, in different towns in 1942, in the spring of 1942. So when Elizabeth's mother contacted me, Elizabeth was 24, and she was still extremely phobic of prop planes going overhead. So she told her mother she's terrified. She gets this feeling in her stomach, and she's just terrified. So I referred her to a past life therapist in the UK. So anyway, sometimes these cases are very small, and as you will see later when I tell some of the stories, they get very complicated and big. So children talk about things that they couldn't normally know in their 2 or 3 years of life. And they usually talk about this in the first person, as Chase did. And there's no way Chase knew about the American Civil War and about the weaponry and what it was like to be a male soldier in the heat of battle. And what's interesting, too, is I found that sometimes children would talk about these memories for a few years at least. And the details would remain consistent, which I found fascinating. Like in Chase's case, when 2 years after he had that memory with Normaning, it was almost word for word the same story, the same visuals in his mind. And these memories generally tend to fade between 5 and 7. And as I just described in the case of Daisy Pickles, quite often there's some behavioral patterns with a child or traits that match up to what they're saying. So it's not just a few statements which you could write off there are, other possible explanations. In fact, I had breakfast with, I spoke at a conference a long time ago, and I had breakfast with John Edward, the medium, and he was trying to tell me that past life memories in children are really spirits coming through children. And I said, well, that doesn't account for the behaviors, some physical characteristics like Chase's eczema, which was reminiscent of that wound. This is so integrated in a child's personality that it wouldn't just, it would be like total possession. So in that sense, what's the difference between reincarnation and possession? It's more integrated into the personality, and sometimes the memories fade over time, but the characteristics, the personality traits remain. So this was what I was coming to with my research, and I put an ad in Mothering Magazine and the ARE. I wrote an article for the ARE magazine and for the Journal of Regression Therapy. I started getting letters. Remember letters? It was slow back then, and each letter was precious because each letter was a case. There was no other way to access this information. So I started thinking about, as I was delving into past life therapy and practicing, I was thinking, well, it's really interesting how in past life therapy with adults, there are patterns that you can see throughout a person's life, going back to even the family of origin, even to childhood. They're patterns, and they're the dominant core patterns in people's lives. And in past life therapy, we use those patterns. We look at those patterns as having a precedent in past lives. And I've got to say, we carry over positive traits too from past lives, like precocious abilities, knowledge, wisdom, but we also carry trauma. And it works very much the way PTSD in the current life works. And this is where my focus has been, on healing that trauma from past lives in children. So I was developing this model, based on what I had experienced with Chase and his sister, whom I won't talk about tonight because I don't have time, who also had a phobia that went away after she remembered she had a phobia of fire. And after she talked about her memory with Norman, her phobia of our house burning down went away because she had died in a house fire as a child. So I started doing my research, and it was really hard. You had to go to libraries and bookstores and rely on the mail. But I did see references to Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. And I'm just curious, how many of you have heard of Ian Stevenson? This is an educated group. Okay, so I came across a reference to him, and I think it was in Many Lives, Many Masters, which a lot of people have read, Brian Weiss's first book. And it just mentioned that he did research of children's past life memories. And it's like, I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find any books in the bookstore, so I finally tracked him down through the University of Virginia. And his story is pretty amazing. He was the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia Medical School, and he became disenchanted with Freudian psychoanalysis, and I don't blame him. And his mother, I think, had been a theosophist who... They believe in reincarnation. She was into esoteric literature. And in the early 60s, someone sent him a case of a child in India who had a very detailed past life memory. And he became hooked. He said, this would be amazing research to do to see if this can show evidence for the continuation of a personal consciousness after death. So, he did more than 45 years of research, but mostly in countries that believed in reincarnation, because that's where the cases were coming from. He networked with colleagues in India and Thailand and Myanmar, and he started getting cases, and people would read about these cases in the newspapers in India, and then contact these professors in India who would contact Ian Stevenson. And he documented, before his death in 2008, or 7, I can never remember. He had documented almost 3,000 cases, and I mean documented. He was extremely thorough. He used translators. He went down these dirt roads in Burma on an ox cart, you know, just seeking out these families in very remote areas. And he would document everything the child said, everything the relatives remembered, looking for discrepancies in the story, because he was publishing for his medical colleagues who thought he was nuts. And his research is really outstanding. I had the honor or privilege of sharing some cases with him through a very synchronistic, weird event. After my first book was published, I got an email from Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia, who said he was married to my friend from Asheville, Chris, and he heard about me, and by the way, he's Ian Stevenson's research associate. He's a pediatric psychiatrist, and since Ian's death, he took over his research. But through my connection from Asheville, I met him and met Ian Stevenson, and this was in 2000 when we went to investigate one of my cases in Chicago, which I'll tell you about in a little while. So I had the privilege of joining him on his investigations, which was really fascinating because he was looking to verify memories. He wasn't really interested in the healing aspects of memories. It's all about collecting the evidence, corroborating it with someone who died before, who fit the description that the child gave. And he has some remarkable cases. But he also saw the patterns too, and he documented the patterns in the cases. And again, the young age at which children remember, they can have behaviors that manifest before their verbal abilities, like phobias, for example. A child is particularly phobic of buses or water or fire or odd things. And they have corresponding behaviors in these cases that he was able to prove through the many statements the child made. A lot of children in Asian countries remembered names, places, very specific details, names of relatives, which I wasn't finding with American cases. So he was looking at the cases he could verify, and he really found precious few American cases. So most of them are from Asia. But in the cases, he had about 800 cases that were solved, meaning the child gave enough evidence that they could go find the relatives of this person who had died, check the autopsy reports, check out what the child says. And like in a lot of cases, there were like 80–90% corroboration with the details, which is pretty amazing with any kind of memory, let alone from another life. Yeah, exactly. How about 3 hours ago? So, and a lot of these children in the solved cases recognized relatives from the past. They knew where they had lived, and I will tell you a story in a moment which describes how amazing this is. And anyone who's familiar with the selection process of the Dalai Lama, when they present objects owned by the former Lama, ordinary kids can do that too. They will recognize things they owned in their previous life. You don't have to be a spiritual adept to do that. So what I found what really got me excited when I was reading Stevenson's research, when I began reading it, was he did a lot of statistical analysis, which I couldn't do and wouldn't want to do. But he determined that 75% of the kids remembered how they died. Death leaves a big imprint, especially traumatic deaths, because 50% were traumatic deaths. And I'd say actually the percentage I've seen is higher than that. But what was really blew my mind when I first read this, just having had the experience with my 2 children, is that 35% of these children who remembered how they died had phobias relating to the way they died. The fear that got locked in at the time of death through the trauma carried over. So this is pretty mind-blowing stuff. And then, not only that, and I think it was 1998, Ian published a 2,200-page, two-volume tome called Reincarnation in Biology. 210 cases of children who had birthmarks, birth defects, physical symptoms relating to traumatic injury or illness in the deceased person's body. Chase's eczema is an example. This is a sketch from an autopsy report of a man who died in 1954 in India. He was killed in his village by someone who shot him in the chest. And this shows the display of wounds from the shotgun. So very shortly after this man was killed in a village, a woman in the village dreamed of this man, and in the dream she saw him and he said, "I'm coming to you." So about a year later, this is a photo of this child who was born as a young man a year after this man was shot, and he was born with birthmarks on his chest which correspond to where the person he remembered and his mother had the dream about, who died in the village. When this boy was born, the birthmarks were pretty pronounced, and at age 3 he started talking about the other person's life. He pointed to his birthmarks and said, "This is where I was shot before," and the mother hadn't prompted him at all. And he talked about that other life until he was about 5 or 6 years old, and he loved going to visit the other family. And in India, when this happens, or in cultures where they believe in reincarnation, it's not unusual for the reincarnated soul, child, to want to go to see the other family. In fact, that's quite often the case. They implore their parents to go visit their other families because they miss them. And sometimes they have this really interesting dynamic of relationship where the child does visit the other family and they become part of the family. If we go back and forth, you can see, and this is what Ian did. He would get autopsy reports, medical reports to corroborate that there was a correspondence. This is a very detailed case that Ian investigated in Thailand, and it's worth talking about because you have to see how detailed these cases are. And prior to recent years, there weren't any American cases this detailed. So there was a little boy in rural Thailand named Chennai, and I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. And from a very early age, his favorite play activity was playing teacher. And he would tell everybody, I am a teacher, when people would say, "You're just playing teacher." "No, I am a teacher." And he would organize all the neighborhood kids. He also, around age 3, started asking his grandmother to go back to another town. He named the town, and he said, "My name is really," I don't remember, Baba Gumai. I can't even pronounce the name. And he begged and begged his grandmother, who was his caretaker, to take him back to this other town because he wanted to see his wife. He wanted to see his twin girls. So finally, the grandmother gave in. They got on a bus and went to this town they had never been before. And the bus dropped them off in the marketplace. And Chennai, who was 3.5, led them to a house. They knocked on the door, and an elderly couple answered the door, and he called them mother and father. And he had told his mother, his grandmother, that he died when he was riding his bicycle on his way to school, that someone shot him in his head. So when they got to the door, he called the elderly people mother and father, and he said, "I am your son." And they invited the grandmother and the child, Chennai, in, and the grandmother said, he said his name is this, and that he was a school teacher, and that he was shot in the head on his way to school on his bicycle. And the elderly couple said, "Yes, our son died that way." And he was introduced to the family, and immediately he recognized the twin daughters he had left, who are now teenagers. And he said, "I'm your father," and he correctly named them. He asked for blue jeans that the school teacher had bought right before he died, and he said, "I put them in the closet." And they said, "Yes, the jeans are still there." And which is really interesting, because like of all the things in the world, you'd think when you die you'd forget about that stuff. But I guess buying new blue jeans in rural Thailand was a major big deal. And interestingly, the elderly people were not that convinced that this was their son reborn. I guess maybe there were scams in Thailand about rebirth or something. But Chennai asked for an amulet, a necklace with amulets on it, and he said there are 3 Buddhas on the necklace. And the family got this necklace and only had 2 Buddhas on it, and he said, "Where's the other Buddha?" They had given one of the Buddhas to one of the daughters after he had died. He remarked about changes to the house since his death. It just goes on and on and on. And the teenage girls were not too thrilled, because this is a 3 or 4-year-old insisting that they call him father. It's just very strange, but if you grow up in a culture like that, it's not as strange. But what most convinced the family that this was their loved one reborn was the fact that Chennai was born with 2 birthmarks on his head that matched the entry and exit wounds of the bullets that killed the school teacher. And his wife, who was there, that's an interesting dynamic. It makes me think of Macron. And actually, okay, but Stevenson actually had a case where somebody in Burma was killed in some insurrection, a young man. He was like 17, 18, 19, and he was married, and he was killed. He reincarnated in the vicinity, and from a very young age, he wanted to find his wife, who and he was born just a couple years after his death, reborn, and he actually met the wife, and they married. So there was like a 20-year age difference. It's kind of freaky stuff. So. But, so it was the birthmarks, and actually Ian Stevenson had documented about 19 cases of multiple birthmarks corresponding to fatal wounds or injuries in the former life. So there is, because of Ian's work, there is actually very solid physical evidence for carryover. It's not just, oh, I have this memory. Oh, it's integrated in the personality. There's a physical correspondence, which I think is extremely compelling, even for skeptics. But we got a long way to go here. So anyway, I was putting together this model in my mind of how parents could help children who are having traumatic memories resolve them in cases where the kids were troubled, and oftentimes they are. They aren't at peace about their deaths. There is no resolution. There's no closure because they died suddenly, they died traumatically, for whatever reason. So I was putting together this model in my mind, but I didn't really have a way to test it out, that there are ways to help children talk them through the trauma as it was coming up spontaneously in these young children. And then a woman from Chicago saw my little reader ad in Mothering Magazine and called me on the telephone, no email, and she said her 2-year-old, she believed, was having memories of a traumatic past life. Could I help her? She said, I don't think I should take him to a psychologist. They'll think I'm crazy if I say that I think he has a past life memory. So we talked on the phone a few times, and she told me that when Blake was a little old, probably a little older than in this photo, he ran to the front door as his older brother was getting on the school bus, and he started crying, and Colleen, the mother, ran and said, what's wrong? He said, man hit me with truck. And Blake had started preschool, and she said, a toy truck, right? And he said, no, a big truck. He was very adamant, and these kids are very adamant. If you challenge them on the details, they will be, no, big truck. And Colleen said she had just heard Brian Weiss on Oprah right before this, who made one remark. He said, sometimes children can remember past lives. And she wondered, could this be a past life memory? So she asked him questions. She said, well, what happened? He said, I went under the wheels. And then what happened? He said, I was taken to a big place. Or he said, a school. And Colleen said any big building to Blake was a school, because that was the only big building he knew from his brother. He said he went under the wheels, and he kind of ran his hand down the left side of his body, and he said, ran me over. And she said, well, what happened? Where were Mommy and Daddy? And he said they had gone bye-bye at the store. So apparently they weren't with him. And she said, well, then what happened? He said, I died. And when you hear your 2.5-year-old say that they died, that is one of those moments of shock where you don't know what's going on. So, you know, she was hoping that this was just a passing fantasy or something. But a few weeks later, a garbage truck passed, and Blake said to Colleen, that's just like the truck that hit me. So he wasn't forgetting it. She was trying to forget it. About 3 months later, they went to London because Blake's father was British, and they were standing on a sidewalk in a very busy section of the city, and Blake was in a stroller. He was 3 at this point. All of a sudden, he got up out of the stroller and walked in the path of an oncoming truck. And thank God, the father pulled him back, and you can imagine what the other bystanders, like, you know, you can't control your child. But it was a near miss. But at that moment, Colleen said, oh my God, I hope he's not repeating something from this past life, whatever this is. So at this point, she contacted me, and she said, yeah, after this is, she said after she was starting to put things together in her mind that maybe this wasn't just imagination, that this was really serious, and she was very scared. So she said it was interesting because after Blake first remembered being hit by the truck, his personality changed. He became very withdrawn and depressed. And she said his nickname had been Smiley. He was the most happy, outgoing child. And she thought, well, it's probably my fault because I have an older child and a younger child, and he's the one in the middle. Maybe I'm neglecting him. And she would try, he also was, Blake was complaining about aches and pains on the left side of his body. And she didn't relate it to what he said about being hit by the truck at that point. And she would try to comfort him and massage him, and he would push her away and say, I love you, but I hate you. And she was really disturbed, you know. As mothers do, we take it all on. So she was telling me all of this, and I was kind of going by the seat of my pants, testing out what I had learned. And I said, well, first of all, very young children have a difficult time differentiating between past and present. To them, the past life that they're remembering is as present as something that happened to them last week. So you have to clarify to him that what happened was before, that he's now safe in a new body. And when she told me that Blake had said that parents had gone bye-bye at the store, and I said, you need to tell him that you're a different mommy. In this life, you'll keep him safe. So I said, wait until he's relaxed, like after bath or before bedtime, when children are receptive to these memories in the hypnagogic state. And I used to joke that, my husband's here, we used to call the car seat the time machine, because a lot of kids would have memories as they were riding in the car seat. You know, when you lull a child to sleep, it's a great device for parents to use if they want to put their kid to sleep. And they would go into the hypnagogic state and start talking about past life memories while the mother was driving. So my first bit of advice was pull off to the side of the road so you don't have an accident, because you're going to go into shock if they start talking about it. So I was giving Colleen some ideas on how to help him know that this is something that happened before. He's in a different life, in a different body. So I was kind of crossing my fingers that this would work, because I didn't really know any therapist they could take him to. So about a week later, Colleen called. She said, "You won't believe what happened." And I was like, uh-oh. And she said, Blake, I was massaging Blake as he was getting ready to go to sleep. And I said to him, first of all, you acknowledge what the child says. The worst thing you can do is dismiss it and not encourage them to talk about it. So she said, remember when you were hit by the truck? And he said, yeah. And she said, well, you had a different mommy then. And his eyes got really wide. He said, a different mommy? And she said, yeah, I'm your mommy now. And she named all the members of the family, her brothers and aunts and uncles, to ground him in this reality. And she said, and you were in a different body. And he said, a different body? She said it was like Christmas. All of a sudden his face lit up. And, yeah, different body, different mommy, and we'll always keep you safe. And she said, he woke up the next morning, he was back to his smiley self after being depressed for, it was probably about 6 months at this point. And she said all the aches and pains on the left side of the body that he had complained about completely went away. So that was my test case. And I can't tell you how happy I was that Colleen called me and it worked. And she said, well, I'm going to call Oprah, or I'm going to write a letter to Oprah and tell her about this. And I said, well, wait until I write my book. At this point, I was thinking, well, someday I'm going to write a book. So a year later, I got a call from Oprah's producer. That's how I got on Oprah. She said, we're going through our files for show ideas, and Colleen Hawkins' letter came up. And she said, is this true? And I said, yeah. And she said, do you have other cases? And I said, yes. And my kids and I and some other parents went on Oprah with their kids. I had very few cases at that point, but it was enough. So Oprah did a whole show on it, which got me a publishing contract. But also, more than that, I was scared to death, too. Can you imagine my first public speaking gig for $22 million? Steve was with me, and the kids were with me on the plane. Honestly, I was praying for the plane to crash, which is not cool. But so I started writing furiously, and I was getting more cases from the Oprah show. And by 1997, I had enough material, and struck when the iron was hot. And Steve helped me write this first book. And I had a miracle publishing story. I had a meeting with the president of Bantam Books directly, and they published it, much to my delight. And because of Steve's foresight, they put my website address in the book. And Bantam Books says, we don't do that. What is this? We don't do that. But fortunately, because of that and because of the internet, I started getting a lot of cases. But if any of you have written a book, you know how much work it is, and I swore I'd never do another one. It's like having your first child, and you go, I don't think I could have another child because it's too much work. But, well, it wasn't my doing exactly. And then the book took off. That was a bestseller in Brazil. That's why I showed the Portuguese. I mean, it was on the side of buses and stuff, which kind of blew my mind because I had a friend who was in Brazil, and he said he saw it. But anyway, the best part of that was I started getting a lot of cases, and people started hearing about it, and I did more TV shows. So it was getting out there. So after I swore I'd wouldn't write another book, it was too damn hard, I got a call from a mother, again in the Chicago area. And Chicago is just a hotbed of all the psychic activity, I guess. And I was aware that sometimes souls could reincarnate into the same family, and I had mentioned a case or two in my first book. But I got a call from this very timid mother by the name of Kathy Luke. And she told me her story in a very flat affect, and you'll understand why. She was a teenage mother, and she had a little boy by the name of James. When James was 17 months old, he was diagnosed with neuroblastoma. He had a large tumor behind his left eye, which caused blindness in that eye and caused his face to droop. He had 17 tumors in his legs. He had tumors in his mouth. He had a big tumor behind his right ear that was biopsied. They did some treatments, but they inserted an IV in his neck during one of the surgeries. And at some point, the doctor said, there's nothing more we can do, and Kathy took him home. And right before he died, he said, "Mama, don't cry for me." And she took that to heart, which is not a really good, healthy thing to do. So, it was devastating watching her son die. And after that, she met a wonderful man, and they married, and she had a daughter, and she had a son, and she got pregnant again, and she was delivering this, would have been her fourth child, in a C-section. She needed a C-section to deliver this child. And as she was recovering from the anesthesia, these doctors filed into the room and said, "We have some really bad news." And after losing a child, you go to the worst case scenario, and they said, "When we have bad news, it appears he's blind in his left eye. It's opaque. And he has he said, it looks like a tumor behind his right ear, but it's just a functional cyst. It should go away." She said, "Bring my son to me." And she held him, and she said, with the other children, after a child dies, you look for that essence in another child. She said when she held that child, she said, it felt just like James. She looked at him, she saw the eye, she saw the cyst, and he had a birthmark scar on his neck where the IV had been on James. So this is a woman raised in Kentucky, fire and brimstone Baptist, and she said, James is back. But she didn't tell anybody because her family would have disowned her. And they lived in Kentucky, and she was in Illinois. So she just didn't say much about this, but she knew. So around age 4, Chad, the new son, started saying weird things like, he said, remember where we used to live? And he described the apartment she had lived in with James, and he asked for toys that they didn't have, which belonged to James. And he said, I want to go back there. And she asked why. And he said, because I left you there. He walked into the room one day, and his older brother was there, and he told him, I got sick and died, but now I'm back. I'm sure that sent the brother running in terror. Can you imagine? But this is, it's very matter of fact. Like, I died. I'm back. So he asked Kathy at some point, do I need surgery again? She said, you've never had surgery. He said, oh, yes, I did before. And she said, where did you have surgery? He said, behind my ear. And he pointed to his right ear. And she said, did it hurt? And he said, no, I was asleep. And James had had anesthesia for that surgery. So it was getting weirder and weirder, and he was talking more and more about this other life, at which point she contacted me. Oh, he also said she showed him a picture of James, which she had kept hidden. She didn't show the other children because she really shut down her grieving process after James died. And she showed him a picture, and he said, I want that. And she said, why? He said, because it's me. And quite often, and this will come up in the same family cases, when a young child sees a picture of a deceased relative and they're the reincarnation of the deceased relative, they'll say, that's me. And of course, most 99% of parents would write that off as, no, that's not you, that's Grandpa. So I talked to Kathy on the phone for about 2 years, I think. And, it was a long process until she finally got up the courage to just say, yes, I remember you know, you were here before and now you're back and I'm so happy and you're in a healthy body. And it was interesting because Steve answered the phone once when she called after way into this process. And he said, she sounds really different. And she said, and Kathy's grief was something resolved in her when she saw that her son was really back. And she said, I don't have to go to the cemetery every day or every week. I'm at peace. So it's like, okay, I'll write another book. And then, honest to God, as soon as this happened, I started getting flooded with these same family cases, which led to this. I had collected a number of cases. This book came out in 2001, and they're just amazing, the different configurations of grandparents dying, coming back to as their own grandchildren. You know, my own grandpa, that gives that song new meaning. But the most amazing cases of children who die and come back to the same mother. You know, it could be after a few years. I had a few cases where well, it gets complicated with the terminology, but the women who contacted me's mothers died and came back as their own children. And there were these miracle pregnancies. You know, these souls just really wanted to come through after the doctor said, you know, you can't get pregnant again, it's impossible, and they would get pregnant. So the soul has its way of finding its way in if it needs to. And in one of my investigations, when I was doing research for this book, I went out with Ian Stevenson to visit the Luke family because he was fascinated by the birthmarks and the birth effects. And he wanted to document the case because there were very few American cases that he had at that point, and I was getting a lot of them. So it was interesting because I asked Dean, I said, well, why do you think people come back in the same family? And this was this incredible man of science, and if you read any of his books, his research is amazing. There's no other word to describe it. It's so meticulous, and he was so dogged in his research, traveling millions of miles over 45 years to these remote areas to interview these children and their families and do the hard work. But I said, well, why do you think that a soul will come back to the same family? And he looked at me and said, isn't love enough? And sometimes it's more than that. Sometimes the family needs the soul born into the family. Sometimes the soul the soul needs to come back to do it better. And I have a couple cases of mothers from hell coming back as their own grandchildren, and how when the mothers figured it out, they go, I'm going to raise this child in a better way so they will be able to learn and grow. So I was starting to get these very detailed cases and very remarkable cases that I hadn't seen in Ian Stevenson's work with the American cases. And this is one, this family went on the Katie Couric show with me, which she did a terrible job of doing this, but Trenny, the mother, got to tell her story. In 1993, Trenny, this young mother, her brother, who was a basketball player in college, died in a single-car accident in Colorado. They don't really know the circumstances, but he was thrown from the car and died. In 1998, Noah was born. That's 5 years after Craig's death. And at age 2, he showed this precocious ability in basketball. He could dribble with either hand, and he knew the terminology, and she thought, well, that's interesting. He has a natural talent. He has a natural aptitude. And this was at age 2. At age 3, she was driving the car. He was in the back in the car seat, and he was trying to get Trenny's attention while she was driving, and all this, she was distracted. He said, damn it, Hanny, I'm trying to talk to you. And at that point, she went into shock, pulled over the side of the road, because Hanny was the nickname her brother used with her, the only person who called her Hanny. And, you know, at this point, she's wondering, could this be my brother reborn? I forgot to mention, at the same age, he had said to her before, and it didn't register, he said to her 3 times, last time I was here, I fell out of my car and died. Then I flew up in the sky. He said it 3 times, and it wasn't until he called her Hanny that she thought, oh my God, maybe he's trying to say he is Craig. So they were going on a family trip to the house in another city where Hanny lived, where Trini lived with her family while she was growing up. And Noah was in the car seat in the back. At this point, he's 3.5. They drove past the former house and then stopped out in front, and he said, that's where we used to play basketball. And the father said, when did you play basketball there? And he said, when Mommy and I were kids together. And the weird thing was that there was no basketball hoop there. The house had been remodeled, and the hoop had been taken down. So he actually had this memory. And after that, he started saying things like he asked for this toy that he had had before, and it just went on and on and on. And another interesting aspect of this is that Craig he chipped his tooth doing some sports, and he always had a chipped front tooth. Noah was born with that same chip on his tooth. It was not hereditary. Also, both boys had a speech impediment. And this is Craig, right before his death. These are Noah and Craig's baby pictures. Wow. Yeah, and, you know, you could say it's heredity, but it just, you can hardly tell. And even Trini's mother, who, you know, a lot of these people are devout Christians, they don't want to believe this, but she said one Thanksgiving they were sitting around the table and little Noah asked for the Jell-O dish that she used to make for Craig. So, you know, it just goes beyond. These two look so much alike. So I keep getting these cases, and the more I see, the more I believe that reincarnation in the same family, and we're not talking, you know, you could call it a soul group, but we're talking about immediate family can happen very quickly after death. It can happen in less than 9 months. Don't know how that works, but it does. So when I was in Chicago on that trip visiting the Luke family, I was having breakfast with Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, and we were asking, why can't we find any American cases as detailed as the Asian cases? It seems like, you know, my books have been out, it seems like parents are becoming more aware of this, and maybe we'll get some cases. And I said, I just want to find a really good American case, as good as the ones you found that can be validated or verified. So, in 2001, I got an email from a mother in Louisiana who said, I think my son is having a traumatic past life memory. He wakes up 5 times a week with nightmares of his plane crashing. He's hysterical. He says, it's burning, little man can't get out, and he's absolutely hysterical. And they really have a hard time calming him down. And she said, my mother sent me your book. And I did what you suggested in the book. I entered his reality. I said, yes, your plane crashed, but you're okay. You're okay now. You're safe in another body, etc. This is little James. So after she had talked to him, entered his reality, acknowledged his memory, the nightmares went from 5 times a week to 1 every 2 weeks or so, and then stopped completely. But right after this, as he acquired more language, he started talking about his life as a pilot. From a very early age, he was obsessed with airplanes. He had model airplanes all over the house. Anytime they went to the store, Andrew had to buy him a model airplane. And he would know things about the planes. Like he picked up this plastic plane once, and there was something on the bottom. And he said, that's a drop tank. And Andrew said, what's a drop tank? He said, he described what it was, and she said, she had no idea. So he started talking about his life as a pilot, and he said, and Andrea asked him open-ended questions, which is exactly the right thing to do. You don't want to plant suggestions, but you want to keep the conversation going. So you keep, oh, you know, then what happened, or, you know, what, as she did. She's, in fact, Bruce, the father, was a really kind of a fundamentalist Christian who didn't want to believe in this at all. So he would try to challenge James, and you know, he said, "Well, you flew plane?" And yeah. "What kind of plane?" He said, "A Corsair." So Bruce would go to the computer, look up, yeah, Corsairs were planes that they used in World War II. They took off of aircraft carriers. So Bruce said, "Well, where'd your plane take off of?" He said, James said, "A boat." You know, he's about 3 at this age. Little kid. And Andrew would say, "Well, what's the name of the boat?" And he said, "Natoma." So Bruce went back to the computer. There was an aircraft carrier in the Pacific in Natoma Bay. Okay, so Bruce, you know, said to him, "Well, that's Japanese." And he said, "No, it's American." This is the 3-year-old, you know, disputing this. No, it was an American ship, which is true. The Natoma Bay was a U.S. aircraft carrier. And he would tell his dad, like, how he would used to take off the planes, and when they landed, that he would get flat tires all the time. And Bruce did research, and he went deep into the research. He was really good at research. And he found that that was a defect with the Corsairs, that they would get flat tires when they landed. So it went on and on and on. And, you know, Andrew was like, "Bruce, come on, you know, this is his memory." And anytime James drew, which was often, he would always make the same types of drawings of planes being shot down in the front, where the propeller is. And he would always sign his name James 3. And they would ask him, what's James 3? And he would say, I'm the 3rd James. So that, okay. And they would ask him what his name was in the past, and he would say his name was James. So, you know, Bruce would say, "Oh, see, couldn't be real." And they asked him if he remembered anyone from the Natoma Bay, and he said, "Yeah, my friend Jack Larson." So Bruce got deep into the research, went to a Natoma Bay reunion under the pretense of doing research about a book about the Natoma Bay in World War II. And he found out there was a surviving pilot by the name of Jack Larson, and he met with another pilot, and he was trying to figure out who James could have been at this point. So when Andrea called me, the case wasn't very well developed, and a producer from ABC Primetime had gotten in touch, and she wanted to do a war memory, a child's war memory. I said, "This is the only one I have that's current that might be interesting." But there really wasn't that much, but we did a taping, and they decided not to air it. So during that interim between not airing it and reshooting it, Bruce talked to some Natoma Bay survivors, did some research, and James had seen a book that Bruce had of World War II battles in the Pacific. He opened to a page, and there was an aerial shot of Iwo Jima, and James was standing next to him. He said, "Daddy, that's where my plane went down." And that was the moment for Bruce when he became a believer. After all that, it was that moment, though, something, he just had the shock wave through his body, which we get when we know they're talking about this. So with that information, he talked to some of the survivors, and he found out there was one pilot from the Natoma Bay that had gone down in that area near Iwo Jima. His name was James Houston Jr., James 3, and his plane was hit in the propeller. It caught on fire, and he went down. So ABC contacted us again, and this time the story was really well developed for television and for us. And this is just more drawings from James 3. So they did a segment, it's 2 segments on James Leininger's story, and they did a really good job. You can find it on YouTube. And after the show was aired in 2004, a Japanese film crew picked up on the story, and they invited the Leiningers to go to Japan, and they hired a boat, and they went to the site where James Houston's plane went down. And they did a little memorial service. They threw a bouquet in the water. James was about 7 at this point, and he saluted, and he said, "I'll never forget you." And everybody on the boat was in tears, the film crew, everybody. But after that, he had closure. You know, it was done. He could be in the moment, in his body, as James Leininger. And this is really interesting. This is right before the ABC primetime show aired. Andrea had found that James Houston had a surviving sister in California, and they had talked to her on the phone, not telling them exactly what they were doing, but saying they were writing a book about the Natoma Bay, and they had a few questions about her brother. It was kind of sneaky, but you know, I said, "Andrea, you know, before this airs, if she happens to turn on the TV, she's going to have a heart attack. You've got to call her." And she found out that Ann Barron had a daughter, and they called the daughter and told her what was up, and she went over and sat with her mother, with Andrea called and told her. And Ann Barron, the sister, said, well, the day her brother died, she saw him in spirit in her house in California, and she knew he had died before they got the telegram. So this is James Houston Jr., who died at 21. Beautiful young man. Here he is in his plane. Here he is standing in front of a Corsair. Look at the face, too. The facial architecture is very similar, and they are not related in the least. You see, here's a better one. You see the chin and the nose. There is a resemblance. And here are childhood pictures. So after the ABC primetime aired, they took James to a reunion, and Ann Barron was there, and he was 4-ish at the time, 4 or 5. He just went right over to, look at the looks on their faces. And she accepted that he was the reincarnation of her brother who died. And this is Jack Larson, his buddy from the Natoma Bay. I forgot. Isn't that great? I forgot an interesting detail, and that's why I took notes, because some of there were just so many details. James had 3 G.I. Joe dolls, and he named them Leon, Walter, I forget, some odd name, Leon, Walter, and an unusual name. I'll say Freddie. It turned out that, and he would talk to them, and he said, he told his parents, they asked why he named them this, and he said, because after I died, they met me in heaven. So Bruce found out that there were 3 people from James Houston's squadron who were killed before him who had those first names. I don't remember the last names, but it was Leon, Billy, and Walter. Leon, Billy, and Walter. I mean, it just gets freakier and freakier. So one of my favorite parts of it, I mean, it's an amazing case, and it just, there's a lot more detail. They wrote a book that was published in 2009 called Soul Survivor, and the full story is in there. But I love this story. Chris Cuomo interviewed me in New York for this segment, and he was so rude to me. He was so rude that his camera guys and the other guys came up after and said, "We think your work is really interesting." And I said, you know, yeah, well, whatever. They were apologizing for their boss. So Chris Cuomo went down to interview the Leiningers in Louisiana, and this is right out of the Twilight Zone. The doorbell rang while he was interviewing them, and there was a package from Ann Barron, James Houston's sister, and in it, she sent these were the effects that were left after he died in his locker or whatever on the ship. There was a bust of George Washington, and James picked it up and smelled it, and he said, "It smells like a battleship," and he ran and put it on his desk in his room. And in Ann Barron's letter, he said, "This is a bust my brother kept on his desk." And there was a Bakelite model of a Corsair. And James was just delighted, but Chris Como was going, "Oh my God, maybe this is real." I just was hoping he'd have a little kid who had past life memories and he'd end up calling me. It'd be sweet. Yeah, it'd be sweet. And I'd say, "I'm sorry, I don't talk to you." But anyway, so this is what happened to James's artwork after they went to Japan. No longer are the ships being shot, the airplanes being shot down from the sky. You know, it's not a battle scene. There are dolphins and a whale. Closure. And this is something that Andrea sent to me, to Mom from James, and it's an intact airplane going over a field of flowers. And it's just sweet. That was a great case. I still like it. And then there's another one that I like even more. That's unpublished. It won't be published. And you'll understand why. So, because of my husband's forethought, we established a past life forum in 1997 when my first book came out. And people from all over the world have posted their questions about children's past lives and their cases. And in 2007, a mother from California posted the story of her son, Kyle. He was born in California. He was obsessed, just like James Leininger with his World War II airplanes, he was obsessed with firefighting. Everything firefighting. For potty training, got a firefighter's little outfit. He got the belt with the stuff, the gear on it. He would get up early in the morning, and this is when he's 2 and 3. He would get up, he'd take his toy axe and pretend to chop down the walls, saying, "There's a fire behind them." And he set up his room like a fire station. And here's a picture of Kyle. This is when he was a little older, but this started it, before he could really talk. He was into firefighting. When he was 3, his mother was reading him this Curious George book, and before bedtime, and he pointed to the Twin Towers, and he said, you ready? "Bad men knocked down the buildings. Planes broke them. I couldn't get to the people. They were calling for me." And he got very upset. So from that point on, he started talking about his life as a fireman. And he said they would say, "You're going to grow up to be a fireman?" "No, I am a fireman." He would insist he was a fireman. Actually, he said, "I'm fire rescue." He would talk about the bucket trucks, how they would go up and down and you pushed levers. And he said when you finally got down, it would bump before you hit the bottom. And he said his truck had a number 3 on it. His hat had black and white, yellow stripes. That his fire station, they got a new fire truck. It had a TV on it and there was a boat on top. He would give his mother directions to the firehouse downtown. He said firemen would follow the leader up a line. If someone falls off the line, they use a bright light and camera to find them, and then they have to say cheese. They had Christmas parties at the fire station. One day they had a party, they were making popcorn, and they burned the popcorn, and they took it out of the firehouse and put it out with the hose, and all the firemen were laughing. He said he trains new guys, and his friend Mike, who has 3 kids, trains the older firemen. Every night, Kyle would go into his little sister's room before bed with his little flashlight, and he would do an inspection of the room, and then he'd say, all clear, and then his sister would go to sleep. He has a fear of heights. And he would tell his mother, I like small buildings, I don't like high buildings. He asked his parents for a real air tank and axe because his play ones don't work. He said to her, do you know what happens when you die? You pick a belly and you come back. And if you go to the past life forum, you can read the evolution of the case. It's in entirety, and it is so detailed. His knowledge about firefighting. His mother said that when he was 3, he went on a field trip to a firehouse with his preschool, and she was a chaperone, and one of the firemen came up to her and said, your husband's a firefighter, right? And she said, no. They said, well, he knows everything about the truck. He knows everything about firefighting. So, oh boy, when I got this case, it was kind of mind-blowing. And, she said that Kyle was very upset. The issue was he was upset that he couldn't save the people in the building. So I said, you need to talk to him about that. And you need to tell him he was very brave, and he did everything he could. And she said, he's the sweetest kid. He's very compassionate. He always thinks about other people. Just so many good characteristics, and he's in a very loving family now. So when she posted this on the forum, one of my forum members was a fire chief from Connecticut. And he had his own past life experience, he wrote a book about his life as a Civil War colonel. And he had a lot of corroboration. And his name is Jeff Keene. And Jeff went down the list, everything Kyle said. And he said, yep, that's right, that's accurate, that's true about the levers on the truck, on the bucket trucks. Yes, around that time, the video screens were introduced in the fire trucks. And if he was in New York City, he would have had a boat on top of the fire truck because it's an island. And so many details that weren't even published by her. I had a lot of private conversations with her because we did research and found out who Kyle had been. And we read the obituaries, we read postings from the family, and they're very devout Irish Catholic family on Long Island. And we decided it would not be in Kyle's benefit or the family's benefit to pursue it and say, your son or your husband, your fiance is back as this little boy in California. They took Kyle to New York City when he was 7, and as they were crossing from New Jersey over the George Washington Bridge, Kyle had this look on his face. He said, I remember this. And they were staying on the Upper West Side, and there happened to be a firefighters museum there. And he went in and got some badges, and he wore them on his little fireman's outfit. And they are not Irish, but he went right for the little Irish hat. This is his little shrine in his room. And you see the buttons that he got at the museum, firefighters' buttons. And it's all there. And he came back very quickly. And in one way, I wish we could tell the family that their son is back and he's this wonderful child in California. But, what do you do with this? And, of course, if the media gets hold of it, it's exploited. It'd be good for my career, but it wouldn't be good for Kyle or the family. So we're sitting on this, but you can read about it on the forum. And the forum's free. You get to it through my website. And what struck me about this case in particular was the altruism. There was a trauma from the death, but he wasn't thinking of himself. He was thinking about others, and he's still like that as a little kid. So that carried over. And it remains to be seen if he's going to end up being a firefighter again. But it's just, there's so much detail. And as he's getting older, the memories are fading, but he's still interested in firefighting. And I heard that James Leininger, to back up, just joined the Navy. I haven't talked to the family in a while, but okay. Yeah, I wish him well, and I hope he remains safe. So there's so many amazing stories, and there's a new book out called The Boy Who Knew Too Much. Anybody heard about it yet? Okay, so this mother in Malibu, she looks like a Malibu mama, called me. I wasn't going to talk about it, but she called me when her son was 2.5. He's a baseball prodigy. Have you heard about this? Yeah, so one of the coaches said he started talking about when he was a tall baseball player before. And someone spotted him playing baseball in a video, and he got a bit part in an Adam Sandler movie. You know, he was throwing the baseball or hitting the baseball in the movie, and this was in Massachusetts, and his mother took him to Fenway Park, and they were walking through one of the corridors, and there was a picture of Babe Ruth, and he looked at it and he said, Babe Ruth was always mean to me. You know, he's like 3, 4, I think he was 4 at the time. Well, the case developed and developed and developed. He's the reincarnation of Lou Gehrig, I'm pretty sure. So it's going to be, they're making a movie about it, and her book came out recently, and I helped her at the beginning, and then I lost touch with her, and then I heard, you know, she was writing a book, and I helped her with that a little bit. But it's a pretty good case. You know, it's a very compelling. You have to read it, and, you know, she's really taking it to the max with social media and the movie, and I hope it's okay for Christian, her son. Another case where she was very Christian, speaking of Christian, her son's name is Christian Haupt, and her name is Kathy Bird. Kathy really didn't want to believe this at the beginning. That's why her son's baseball coach encouraged her to contact me, because I normalized it for her. I told her what to do, how to talk to him, and said, yeah, this happens all the time, but his precocious baseball ability is pretty astounding. And there are a lot of strange synchronicities with that story, too, like Christian's father's from Germany, from the same region that the Gehrig family was from. And just weird details that, and not some weird, you know, just very obvious connections with Lou Gehrig. So the book is out. It's a good read, and it's called The Boy Who Knew Too Much. So these detailed cases are coming now. You know, as more people become aware of it, it's changing the mass consciousness, and I think that's what it's going to take to really get this information out there so that parents can help their own children resolve these traumas from the past and help them heal their souls so they don't have to carry this into adulthood and end up in my office and I have to regress them as adults. Because these patterns, a lot of them will persist if they're not addressed when the kids are young. And when I work with adults, we go back to these early phobias, we go back to these other experiences they had, and it all ties in. You know, the evidence was there when they were young in the core patterns. So, any questions? We have, yes?
Has anybody asked these kids why they came back?
Say again?
Has anyone asked them why they came back?
No.
Would you repeat the question?
No. Okay, has anyone asked them why they came back? Not really, not to my knowledge. I think the parents are so shocked, except that sometimes the kids say they chose to come back, and they will tell the parents that they picked them. So that's not unusual. I don't know whether they could even answer that question when they're 2, 3, and 4. And by the time 5 to 7, they usually forget about the memories. Like in my son's example, he still has memory because we kept it alive, but the emotional component of the memory is not there anymore. He has the visuals from that battlefield. He remembers the story, but he's not emotional about it. He doesn't have a phobia. He doesn't have the fear. It's just a memory. I guess they could ask.
So when you're regressing adults, then you're trying to help them go back to this memory, but the memory is pretty much gone.
You can bypass childhood. You can go in on the feelings, use an affect bridge, and go back. I know you're a therapist. That's why I'm telling her that.
classes are extraordinary.
Thank you. I've been doing it for almost 30 years now.
Why don't you do children anymore? You say,
No, you can't regress these young children. It's not appropriate. When the memories are coming up spontaneously, you can address them as they're coming up spontaneously. That's the message in my book. You don't want to regress children, and I caution people, you don't regress, and it won't work anyway. But, you have to, it's a developmental phase, and, 5 to 7, concrete operational phase, they forget them. Steve, is that why you were signaling me?
Next one.
Oh, okay. There, in case you're interested. It's my husband, Steve, who helped me write the books. I couldn't have done it without him, egging me on because I was ready to quit. Yes.
This many years ago, I read the book on Hubbard, that crazy book, Dianetics.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff, I have to reread that. There's a lot of stuff that addresses this in that book.
And strangely, we went to Puerto Rico right after we finished writing the book. We were walking around the old part of town, and this woman, I started talking to this woman. She went into the house and got this book on Dianetics and children. It was the weirdest encounter. It follows me. But I know what you're talking about. Yes, in the back, all the way in the back.
Hey, Harold. I was just going to say, about 10 years ago, I was in college, and I came to you, actually.
Okay.
Out of any experiences or past life memories, that I had on my own, but just I was curious about the subject.
Yeah.
And so you kind of sat with me. We went through the interview process. I got some kind of reading and gave me a tape recording, which I threw out that day because I kind of dismissed it. I guess my question is, I keep thinking about the memory I got. It was pretty visual, not visual, but I remember, a story.
Yeah.
Fine, had to do with the Native American period, probably mid to late 1800s, and involved one of my siblings. How do you know if that's really valid or if that's kind of a product of your imagination? I mean, I don't know. I never really had that.
Did it have any relevance to this life? Did it explain anything about relationships in this life or anything about you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it just wasn't a good memory, I can tell you that.
Well, we work with the traumatic memories because that's what needs to be healed.
Yeah.
Well, I'll talk to you. We can talk about it. I'll pull more information from you after, okay?
Yeah.
I'll be here for a little while. Yes, Amy.
thank you, Carol. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Amy.
The first woman who asked a question after your presentation said, do they ever explain why? And my third daughter did.
Oh, tell us. What? Could you stand up and...
We communicated about my third daughter and the dream when I was pregnant with her that my grandmother told me when she'd be born to the hour and what to name her. And when my third daughter Lily was 2 and 3, she was doing all these things that were just, that she wouldn't have known that my grandmother did. When I put her to bed at night, she used to go, she was to my cheek, and I never taught her that, but my grandmother did that. And one night when I was fixing dinner in the kitchen, I heard clattering, and I thought she was falling down the steps. So I ran out, and she was holding this big black and gold lacquered bench that was my grandmother, that I took to my house and put in the upstairs hallway after my grandmother died. And I ran out and I said, I was scared. Are you all right? I heard this noise, and I thought, you fell. And she goes, I'm fine. I'm just putting this in my room. It's mine. So she did that. And,
oh, wow.
One time when she did the bougie, she said, you were always my favorite. And my grandmother and I were very, very close. So she had 6 grandchildren, and we were the closest. And now I'll be close to you all the time. And so she was explaining, I think, her reason for wanting to come back.
Love.
And once I held, on her birthday, we were taking her back after her birthday party, and I held a mirror up to her and I said, don't you look funny? Because she had shampoo in her hair, and I wanted to show her. And she said, no, my parents used to do all that color. Don't you remember?
Oh.
And I said, oh, something about her birthday, and she whispered, I'm really 93 and a half.
That's perfect.
23 now, and she doesn't do any of that, but I immediately called my mom and said, how old would Natalie be? And it was February, my grandmother's birthday was in August, and she would have accepted it.
Wow. Wow. Thanks, Amy. That's a great story. Yes. Did you? Oh, somebody, Jim?
Okay, I was also one of your past life people.
You're one of my first clients.
I know, about 30 years ago.
I know.
Same as you. Right. I was wondering, have you ever been past life regressed? Could you tell us about it, or your husband, or anybody else?
Oh my God, that's a long story. Yeah, I've had many regressions myself. Like the first one was the most potent, the one where I saw that I died in World War II and my lung problems were cured. I don't really want to spend time talking about that, but I've had many. I've seen a lot of my past lives, and they're usually, whatever comes up is relevant to your present life. You know, you might have to process a little bit, but it's there. Unless you're just making it up. I'd say maybe 3%, you know, it's maybe a metaphor or a story that comes up, but I screen people very carefully now before I work with them too, to make sure that this is appropriate. So I think my methods have changed quite a bit in 28 years. Oh my God, thousands of regressions. Yes.
My son was born with a lot of issues, and I got progressively worse as he got older. I brought him to see you maybe 14 years ago.
What? Oh, really?
And what came out of the session was a very dark past.
Yeah.
And I said, I explained why you're going through what you're going through. You got to pay back. It's a payback time.
I don't really see it as payback.
But the problem is, he thought he made everything on himself. He didn't think anything that he was.
How old was he? Oh, are you that?
He's about 14, 18,
Yeah.
15.
To tell you the truth, I don't work with people that young now. I've learned over the years it's not as effective as when they're a few years older. So I have a policy. I don't work with anyone under 18 unless they're really mature. And this is something I've had to learn through time. You know, there's an appropriate time to do it. And I have people calling from all over the country begging me to regress their children or their young teens, and I don't do it anymore. Having said that, I worked with a 12-year-old from Connecticut, and he was amazing, and his lifelong depression lifted. So, you know, it's like, I take it on a case-by-case basis now. Sure.
Have you ever watched The X-Files from the past? There's just one episode.
No.
There's an episode called The Field Where I Died. And it's about a woman who has all the things part of.
Can you speak up a little so the rest can hear?
There's an episode called The Field Where I Died.
Yeah.
About regression, about past lives. And this woman who's part of a cult, there's like information that she actually has a past. She remembers her past from the Great Depression, from the Civil War, and then Mulder finds out that he was like her husband during it. And the point is, I just want to know if you had seen it.
No.
If that's how it goes.
There are all ways it goes. I mean, and everybody's story is different. And, you know, I don't really believe it's payback. I think we learn what we have to learn. You know, it's not a punitive process. It's like we try to balance. And I think that's the beauty in it, too. It's all about balance. You know, if it's very different. The way I work now is very different because I've learned. And I had some really great experiences regressing like 12, 14, 16, but then I stopped because I was not getting the results that I like. So it's...
What I remember was you made
Yeah.
a tape of it.
Yeah.
I can't find it now.
I'll tell you, I don't have it. Yeah.
But what you did was interesting. When the life was over, okay, now go back to spirit.
Yeah.
You're speaking to him as spirit.
Right.
And once you look back on that past life, what do you think? And once you look forward, what do you think you would do?
And that's what we do. I mean, you go through the... I don't really want to talk about adult regression, but just say briefly that you do go through past life death, which is like a virtual near-death experience in a way. You go into an altered state of consciousness where you can be objective and look back at the life you saw and connect the dots with the themes, the feelings in this life, too. So my work has evolved after 30 years. I keep learning new things every day. Yes?
I have a story. It's the opposite. My third child, Katrina with a K, was my sister. She was born in 1963 in January. My mother had an RH factor. She was premature, not even 4 pounds. She only lived for a couple of days. I was about 7 years old. And I was brought up Catholic, so at confirmation, I picked her name Catherine. That was my sister with a K. And I always felt a connection with her. It was this sort of energy. And after she was born, it wasn't like that. It's like this. And when she was around 7, she said to me, I wish grandparents were my parents. To me, that was a confirmation. And then there was my mother's 75th birthday. I said to my sister, get Mom 12 roses. I said, make 6 of them red, 5 pink for her 2 sons, 3 daughters, and 1 white for Catherine, who passed. The roses came back, 5 pink, not 6 red, but 7, no white roses.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So this is a story in the opposite.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, she's a dancer. My mom was a dancer. She did the public. She was a teacher.
Interesting.
She was 6.5 till now. She's 25. A dancer. And she was born January 29th, and I had her 29 years later, June 9th of 92. And I'm looking at numbers too. So the correlation.
And some people do, yeah.
You know, to just think about that.
Yeah.
You know, so this isn't a reverse revolt, you know, here.
You might like Return from Heaven.
Yeah.
From what you're telling me. Because there's a lot that children remember before they were born. They make contact with the family. They trail the prospective parents. It's pretty interesting.
And very young, they do remember. She would say, "Oh, on the ceiling, I see birds."
Right.
Oh, it's the white ceiling, and they really are fairies because I'm also clairvoyant, and they have abilities. And my dad
Right.
knows. With all of that, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, one more. I just had a general question.
Sure.
Have you ever experienced your multiple past lives with commonalities, or is it always just one past life, the most recent, that the person experiences?
People can remember more than one past life. And are you asking if there's a theme that...
Going back to like the physical attributes, if you have multiple...
Yes, I got it now, yeah.
Will it be multiple, looking back, or is it always usually the most recent past life?
You don't have to go to all of them. If you go to one of them and whichever one rises up, that's the one you work with. In other words, I know I had at least 7 lives I can think of where I died because I couldn't breathe from several hangings. From the gas chambers, with my big mouth. Gas chambers, consumption. I had multiple lives with trauma, died of trauma to my lungs. I didn't need to go back to all of them. There were different issues involved with the different traumas, but it's like the imprint gets deeper with each one. So that really needs to be released. But you can go back to one and release the whole pattern. That's a really good question. That's an advanced question. Thank you.
So I know we're going to end soon, but I'll share my own little story.
Oh, please
I'd like
do.
to hear it. It was really interesting. And I was driving, which is interesting. I didn't even think about that, and I almost drove off the road. My husband and I have 2 children. Before our 2 children were born, I had a pregnancy, which I lost. The due date of that pregnancy was March 17th. Well, I lost that child. I think I was due in like 85 or something like that. So a year later, I was pregnant again. I have a daughter who was born in 87, and then I got pregnant again, and a daughter who was born in 89. So 89 is Juliet, she's my youngest, and Kira was born in 87. She's my oldest. So one day I'm driving along, and Kira, who's the oldest, is looking at the youngest in the back seat, and they're talking, they're kind of like talking to each other. And Kira says, the older one says to the younger one, do you remember before? And then she said, do you remember before here? And Juliet, who's 2, and Kira's probably about 4, Juliet says, yeah, I was gonna come first. And of course, Juliet was born on March 17th, exactly when the earlier pregnancy was due.
Interesting.
So I never forgot that. I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? They didn't know what they were talking about.
Right.
And I'm like listening and I'm trying to
That's why I advise pull over to the side of the road.
I finally pulled over and I was just like, whoa, that's it. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the executive director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have 3 primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings.